jumping right into it, uh, I had many thoughts about uh, the underlying issues in. Oh, I can't remember the title of the video now. Something like Sam Vaknin gets dissed by an ex-client or something like that, and uh, yeah, I can't imagine that my contribution to this topic is going to be insightful to him because I'm not going to do what he asked, I guess, which was, well, I don't know, is relating to what was said. I think he specifically wanted people to relate to what was said in their own personal way, not speak to what they speculate to be the underlying um, issues involved, and to perhaps to hypothesize into the realm of character assassination or ad hominem, which I guess some of my theorizing is probably gets into that, and I'm sure that Sam Vaknin is probably going to be aware, perhaps in some more precise capacity, the sorts of things that I'm alluding to, because I'm not going to speak about them perhaps in a very ironclad and cogent logical procession. Anyway, this is probably enough self denigration. Let me just get into at least what comes up for me when looking at this. I'm sure Sam Vaknin is more aware than I about aspects to Jungian analytical psychology, and yeah, so I mean, I only have a second-hand reading of Jung, talking to people, as I have collected much of my, if you can call it knowledge or insight, has been through deep discussions and not through dealing with the primary material. And usually more on the philosophical side of things, and trying to create a coherent web of understanding of how different people have approached the main subject, which I consider myself to specialize in, which is has been touched on by many thinkers and many philosophers, and in different areas of esoteric thought. Anyway, so I would just say that the kind of intransigence that Sam Vaknin is sort of dealing with is generated from a few sources, and he, I think, even clearly outlines the source of what is rotten in the general field. And even depending on some of his other comments, I mean, it's not too difficult for me to kind of see how these things need to be tackled head on in a combined fashion. Okay, I'm going to stop introducing all the things that I'm going to talk about and just start talking about it. I find it's going to be easier for me. So I was thinking about a lot of interesting things, and my thoughts were actually far more rich than probably what this recording is going to contain. But then I wrote about some of it, so I've got some notes here which I'm just going to go through. They're probably not presented in such a great order, but mystery. So this is a theme that is some in my other videos, talking about spirituality and stuff and the importance of mystery. And so I see that as one of the component solutions in this issue. How does a sick mind conceptualize unwellness and wellness? A metaphysician, almost in this context, I mean like a professional perhaps psychologist, judged against standards of immediate concern. Okay, so that I see is the kind of the crux of the problem. Is, are you going to be judged by your effects when you're dealing with something that is hopefully treating something that's more in the realm of principle? There has to be a model of the process, the therapeutic process perhaps, or the psychological process, that is honest, although incomplete. And that is the essence of mystery, as it were, that you have a something that doesn't contain all the detail, but it is honest. And that, I think, really solves a lot of the problems here. So, informed consent is perhaps intrinsically obviated by the use of mystery, even though mystery is the only appropriate model to these issues. Constructing the right mystery, the right hook that encapsulates a sufficient rendering of the processes involved, that is relatable to the prospective patient in terms of the key boundaries of the framework of the process. This is why mysteries involve a secret, and the secret must even be technically sketched out at the outset within the mystery. So when the pressure from that secret rises during the process, it is not used as a convenient trigger to revert onto conventional gainsaying that insulates and entrenches the habitual comforts of environmental or worldly dependency to be camouflaged within. There are other issues about the quality and the commitment to an authentic communion. I'm just relating that into the concept of honest or genuine therapy, which can only be kept tenable through a greater edifice of reconciliation with understanding and clarity. Being philosophically lazy so as to privilege the experience of the positive reinforcement of effects as a general cult of as a general cult of social convention, it is possible to keep acquaintance. I'm just trying to perhaps illustrate some of these points. It is possible to keep acquaintances with levels of dysfunctional relations, but to get hypnotized and carried away is difficult. To not get hypnotized and carried away is difficult to most people, as normalizing what they themselves have keep facilitating daily will potentially have a corrosive and pollutive effect. But it is possible to balance comedy and drama in one's life, using the old definition of those, so as to not fall into the false binary of reducing all life into merely one of those perspectives, comedy or drama. This involves stoic and long-suffering forms of tolerance, but most people prefer to be intoxicated and reveling in their associations so as to avoid the comedic component of their self-determinism. Again, I'm using comedy in the sense that it means that man governs man's fate in the narrative, whereas drama is that the gods govern the fate of man. And so that is why there is always a critical component in the comedic aspect, and why you find that when fascistic values take over a society, comedy, the subject of comedy, stops being self-criticism and humility and self-determinism, but it's only projected as kind of collective forces and groups, as it were. And so you have a kind of everything gets reduced into a kind of drama of a secular perennialism. Okay, and then I was just going to say that in as it stands within society, you could say already there is enough vague mystique put onto the psychological profession from the general public side, which must unavoidably include competing claims of authority in a no man's land. What I'm proposing is that the mystery, or even the competing mysteries, become explicit and enter even explicit competition as a way to introduce coherent comparison, which would hopefully produce a more workable orthodoxy of which those constructs are presently no, I've lost the grammar here. Okay, I'm just going to read it and then work out what it means. Workable orthodoxy of which constructs are presently failures or unsuitable to various forms of interest from the public. Yeah, so I guess I would have to say relative to the various forms of interest from the public. That's in the context that uh, okay, so I'm saying that we have to generate a more workable orthodoxy with which the public can read what would be a failure or unsuitable to that member of the public. But this would also uncan the pervasive influence of pharmaceuticals which plague society by the lack of this form of coherent integration between the psychological profession and the public, by keeping the field itself in a kind of atrophied disarray and able to collate insights even between itself. Uh, so express mystery could be that vulgar summary made almost comically that outlines a general course of how therapy works, using archetypes to generalize each possible component, that even outlines the general causes of breakdown of the therapeutic alliance. The process described thusly would unveil the prime mystery that is being probed through through the contact of participants I wrote into that process. So grammar is not so good. Uh, and then I went on into a more detailed breakdown of the potential issues in this kind of scenario. So that's just a kind of a general mission statement as to how the field itself could somewhat be reformed into a more coherent competition between the various different modalities and insights. But as I said, the almost the inherent disarray within the field is what allows it to be plagued by the kind of the medicalization aspects. Now, what I'm about to read out next, I probably have better things to say about it, but I was just jotting it down. There are some forms of personality styles and patterns of behavior that create inceptions into unilateral narratives that coerce reality surrealism, and if these tactics and mechanics get limited in their expression, there is often a breakpoint being engineered to generate something akin to some level of psychosis, or almost like a mini psychosis, enough to shed the inhibitory insights that get in the way of developing or deploying those tactics. Not it says deploying, which themselves need enough environmental havoc with which to record enough injury that justifies the defensive maneuvering that deploys the inception. Which is often a way to preserve reactive supply under an adapted labeling system that shifts authority onto some new convenient terminals. People who are, okay, this is a slightly different part of the note. People who are not interested in defining wellness as the search for sanity is a kind of bad faith hedonistic standard. And then I wrote, Jung proposed getting people to the point of appeasement so that they could develop an inclination to detach from their meta-conditioning or internal shadow, or at least to confronting it and making it conscious, or working some kind of interface that's somewhat more accessible to their understanding, or something like that, in search for a new operating platform and self-actualization, self-directed form of self-conditioned determinism. Yeah, that sounds... okay. Freedom as an ends in the therapy process, and depending on the mind-forged manacle involved, freedom not used as the means towards that ends for the first phase of treatment, but an assisted self-sabotage, and I mean that in a technical sense, because technically, no, why do I have to write it so badly? Technically, but ostensibly, exploring and assisting the natural interest of the client, which is only resisted by the clinician by rationalizing through with the client to better crystallize ownership of his or her causative power, to promote a stable false ego from which to move on to dismantling, being the second stage of the therapy process. There is some utility in this, though it requires a professional to carry two faces or a mask that gets unmasked, which can strain trust without an exterior symbol of mastery or authority, which are also served by the mystery story, which could also be served by the mystery story of the sort outlined earlier. The utility in this first phase is to exhaust the curiosity that is naturally depleted by tracing the cycles involved within the reactive circuitry of the false ego. Therapy can also do harm when it attempts to create perpetual tools that endorse spiraling these circuits into tightly wound recursive self-reliance. Dependence on the kinds of rationalization that lean on unconscious issues, which are only ever managed indirectly through redressing belief. So you have to get someone essentially doing this problematic thing of redressing their own beliefs in a kind of stable way that doesn't create a kind of perpetual recursion of a kind of search. You have to actually work out a search that actually exhausts itself, and that means that you have actually pinned down, let's say, the implicit cycles within the when I say cycles, I mean just the recurring patterns, as it were, so that you start getting a matter or a mass with which you can actually have some kind of therapeutic alliance to be the metaphysician about. But before that, let's say that subject is accessible, is only accessible with the right kind of crystallization. And so that's what I was basically trying to, in the note that I was just going through, what I was basically trying to say is that if you're going to have a two-stage therapy process, which is itself slightly problematic, because as I said, that could strain trust. And I believe Jung had a lot of, made a lot of stuff about this. I'm sure he wrote tons about it, about how it breaks down sometimes in that transition. It doesn't get managed properly, and it's a bit of a gamble. And I would say the only way to actually circumvent it breaking down is by having some kind of initial mystery that you can say, but you remember, this is all under the initial framework. And, and so you have to kind of hide a secret within the initial mystery, so that you're not blindsiding the client, probably. But, there are some forms of therapy that are probably so weak, or let's say so even metaphysically impoverished, that they don't even produce respectable enough summaries of their mechanism, because they are themselves denigrating to the kind of the essence of the client. There's problems on both sides, because you can have, let's say, an unwell mind or a sick mind that doesn't want to achieve integrity, or that simply wants to have effects in their immediate environment reflect some kind of positive exterior locus of affirmation, and being able to direct that for oneself is great. But when it's built on a kind of on the usurpation of a kind of causative power, which is essentially what you're trying to rehabilitate, I would at least hope. But obviously, there are a lot of obstacles in that, which are the indirect obstacles that you sometimes have to deal with first, which is why I'm talking about having two phases. The two-phase approach is probably what a lot of these life coaches are perhaps not even tapping into, because they are probably just focusing on some kind of half-baked aspect of the first phase, and what they are essentially doing is selling their client down the river in terms of developing, some kind of very half-baked, I don't even have to go through all of this. One, it's just basically selling a form of self-indulgence that is rationalized and that, has some kind of air of worldly authority. So that the person can be, kind of entrenched confidently. And I would say Sam Vaknin, in this instance, was probably almost a secondary victim of that, let's say, initial mind virus of irresponsibility, as it were, or at least a kind of a militant anti-self-determinism drive, or because the self-determinism has been secondarily, let's say, hypnotized and indentured into your immediate effects should are a reflection of your inner coherence, as it were, and so then you've got a system of conception of self which is unable to perform any meaningful sacrifice. They can do a kind of faux sacrifice that will propitiate the magical gods, but they are not interested, let's say, in the authority of one's own developing understanding. They don't want to understand reality, which was even something that came through in this particular exchange. So I would say that, having this kind of two-phase thing, it has its own hazards attached to it, and it would have to be done very carefully, and it would be wonderful, because I can just imagine if we lived in a different culture or with different mind viruses going around as they do, that maybe when you got a person into the therapy share, you could already start to treat them as a knife that is ready to cut themselves. You want an intellect, or you want a mind that is prepared to cut itself, that is prepared to work on itself. Not a knife, essentially, that only just wants to cut up the effects of its environmental appearances, so that it can select the senses that it wishes to indulge in. And as I said, like that, so the only reason to have that kind of that two-phase approach is that you need to generate enough self-confidence, which is essentially part of the crystallization process, so that you can have a false ego with which to cut up, So, I mean, basically the problem here is that when people have such a dispersed gauge on what their internal composition, that, so they, it is, I mean, I don't really know how people do this, but, in therapy, like, how do you start to get people to say, do you see any patterns in your life? Do you see any recurring incidents? And, these questions themselves can be also hazardous, because you don't want to reduce it down into one thing. Is it, you don't want to say you are causing everything as a kind of solipsism, as if, you might not, it might be that you are just around very particularly sick people that are very particularly sick in very particular ways, and you are being polluted by those influences. But then, there is also anyway. I mean, obviously, there are lots of different categories of psychological phenomena. You could basically say that there are at least 4 species of issues that you have to be somewhat conscious of simultaneously, which is that how are you contributing to the problem? How is the problem being created independently of you? How's the problem being created independently of anyone, in that it's literally just a kind of a happenstance of a kind of it's not necessary that the people have put themselves in that situation, but the situation has occurred, and it has features in it which almost have no trace to any kind of a deliberate intentionality from anyone. So you have to be able to deal with intentionality while at the same time knowing that it's not just intentionality that governs everything and every outcome and every effect. And when you're dealing with that kind of confluence responsibly, then you're maximizing your self-determinism. And then within that context, there's still a lot that you can do for yourself within yourself. So, just because, it's like the Stoic reduction, I think, it's like, can I remember it? It's something like all the things that, all the things that are out of your power, don't worry about them because they're out of your power. And all the things that are in your power, don't worry about them because they're in your power. And all the things that might or maybe are on the borderline between that, those are the things that you have to concern yourself with, because you don't know. And so those are the things that you have to kind of resolve. And as I said, that to be able to categorize and break up those sorts of things does require self-knowledge, which you have to develop, and you can only even start to develop and at least mold that yourself after you've got something crystallized. Okay, let me just go into the crystallization thing, because that's something that I could probably elaborate on further. Is that, let's say, some people have got such a weak internal compass, and when I say, I don't even mean compass in terms of like they don't know where they're going. It's that they don't remember where they've been, and where, they don't keep track of the correlation between their internal compass and their precipitated experiences. And so when people have not done that, when they've not been recording that in themselves, so they've got nothing to trace back on that line, they've got a very facile and disintegrated sense of control and self-direction. And so when someone does not even have that, then all they are doing effectively is just tracing and tracking their immediate effects that they are receiving. So that their immediate inputs and then their immediate output that they get. And, this is a very scattered, antithetical way of being in terms of metaphysics, let's just say. And so if you are a metaphysician trying to give someone the tools of some kind of, and I'm using that word obviously in the psychological context, to order their life with some kind of infusion of principle and order and self-conditioning, the ability to steer the course of your life and the generation or the production of your own purpose through through knowing that you are conditioning yourself and being able to calibrate that conditioning and being conscious of that. That would be something I would say is being driven from understanding and self-realization. Is that the mind itself is this is to talk slightly spiritually, but the mind is always going to produce karma. Karma, in that sense, is inescapable because you cannot exist without a mind, or the people that do, are just essentially implicitly being ruled by karma, because they are essentially they will still have a mind, but it will just be a kind of an anomaly or a capricious one that is kind of governed by their immediate, some sort of system of being triggered in the immediate moment. And that's a very false liberation from karma. How you liberate yourself from karma is that you transcend it, in that you do not try to obviate it, but that you subsume it, and you integrate it within, let's say, an intellectual character, which you identify with being in the image of, and this is essentially the concept of Godhead, that you have to be the same spiritual likeness for, which is why it's often described as the spirit of truth, or the discerning spirit, or anyway. So you get a lot of. I'm not going to turn this into a rant against something else that I've just recently heard, which is so depressing. It's so depressing listening to these so-called radical revolutionary people who are so, so backwards. Yeah, I mean, I guess I was probably going to make a more esoteric point, which is not that helpful. Let me rather just bring it down a notch and just make some illustrations on this point, which is that any thought itself is going to cast a shadow. Any structure within the mind creates a shadow. And that's simply to mean that everything has a limit attached to it. At least any thought has a limit attached to it. And so thinking itself will always be exhaustible. It will always run dry. It will always find a context which will make it wrong and inappropriate. And in other contexts it will be okay and it'll be fine. But there is no system of thinking that is timeless. And the thing that is responsive to that is the intellect. Anyway, so what's the point of me saying that? Is that trying to align yourself with a kind of affection of rationality, and is literally like selling your soul to a program. So like a computer program or something like that you're just going to be completely determined. Is more so important to be aware of the things that are determining your mind, and to be content with that kind of self-selection. And that does mean that you have to have quite a vast philosophical framework that does practically have an answer to every question. Doesn't have to, and that the answer is not going to be the knowledge of good and evil, and it's not going to be a kind of a factual claim. It's going to be standing on a principled it's going to have intellectual roots, and it's going to have an expression in belief that extends from those intellectual roots. And so it will have a disposition. And that is really where the intellect is found. It's within the disposition. It's not it's not a kind of you will not be able to read it off the mark of its effects on or so you cannot read it simply from so it characterizes the way that its purpose is directing it, and so it can be judged and known by the heading and the kind of the work that goes into where it's headed towards. That is the quality of its spirit. What else? Yeah, this is getting very ethereal, but I don't know, perhaps I was going to exemplify some kind of philosophy, but this is a very high level that a lot of people are suffering for the search of it, or for a lack of being in the search of it. But the truth is that they're not really searching for it. They are really just looking for more karma. They're thirsty for being in the right mind faction, and they're unwilling to see, let's say, the more transcendent view of how they've got these false distinctions and these false binaries and dichotomies of what is effectively a fractured intellect, in order to allow them to play this investment into effects and extracting a kind of appearances and senses that give them that external affirmation, which is, it's doomed. It will never be self-satisfied. But that's one of the things. So it's often the right kind of crystallization as a primer toward honestly developing some form of integrity and self-directed self-determinism, or which I've tried to cash out as a kind of self-conditioned, deliberate process that becomes an ongoing process, which is why, for instance, in some scriptural descriptions it says that first seek the kingdom, and that doesn't ever end, in that you're always essentially telling people that you might be wrong, but that this is what you believe. And it's going to be very hard to be convinced of something else, unless honestly you can show a very fundamental self-deception along that particular my grammar's slightly wrong, but edifice. Anyway, I'm just repeating myself now, but I was also going to make the point that it is slightly problematic to have the first phase and the second phase, because essentially the best transition between having someone who's now got a crystallized false ego with which they can actually do something with is that if you've help them rationalize it well enough that they actually have a full model of the ship that they are sailing now. You know, they might not, you know, they have to get exhausted by it in the right way. You can't just kind of cheapen that exhaustion. You can't just kind of artificially construe it. And you have to, how they carry it forward has to be self-determinism. And so how they interrogate it and how they break it down, or, you know, you can assist them and you can give them good insight, but it really has to be their volition that is moving into the uncharted space, and they have to map that space. And, you know, hopefully they will ask for help and consider, but, you know, that requires a real communion, as it were. You can't just sort of list for people a kind of statistical breakdown of where other people have found meaning and good resources in terms of how to move forward. You actually have to be able to resonate with how they are communicating and experiencing that uncharted realm. And, you know, there are some, I would say, basic tools of doing that, which would be focusing on the person's abilities and conceptual abilities, and how those abilities have become associated with you know, very important themes that are usually imprinted somewhere within their psyche. For example, failures and indecisions and such, because those are the subjects which really challenge self-determinism. I'll put as a side note, Scientology deals with all of these very comprehensively and has developed very... that's what the Scientology therapy really focuses on. And those subjects especially are the prime subjects in Scientology discoveries and development. Anyway, I guess that's enough of me ranting.